Welcome to Puro Politics, the political podcast of the San Antonio Express News. My name is Gilbert Garcia, Metro columnist, and I'm joined by
City Hall reporter Joshua Fechter,
business editor and columnist Greg Jefferson,
reporter Brian Chasnoff.
And this is the last week of June, and COVID-19 case numbers are exploding in San Antonio and throughout the state of Texas, and we're in a full-blown crisis right now, and we're going to talk a little bit about the surprise resignation last week of Don Emmerich, San Antonio's MetroHealth Director. We're going to talk about an incident involving Nelson Wolff at a Lowe's store, and former DA Nico LaHood's involvement in that, and hopefully get a chance to talk a little bit about a police reform resolution that Mayor Nirenberg introduced last week that at least for the moment, has been tabled. On the issue of Don Emmerich, Don Emmerich came from Oregon and became MetroHealth Director about 5 months ago. And so she stepped right into the COVID-19 crisis or came just shortly before that, and really never knew a San Antonio that was not sort of under, facing these stay-at-home restrictions or just the extraordinary circumstances that we've been under with COVID-19. Brian and Josh, you all have written about her decision to resign. Brian, if you want to start first, what do you think went into this move, which I think caught a lot of people off guard?
So Josh and I are continuing to dig into more details about why Don Emmerich resigned. My understanding is that this was entirely her decision, so she wasn't forced to resign for any mistake.
Right.
And at first blush, it really does appear that the pressure became too great for her, and she left because just due to that. And I profiled her about a month ago,
right?
And she was complaining about the pressure back then, and this was before the surge, the surge that we're experiencing right now. This was back when the caseloads were at manageable levels. They were mostly in congregate settings and so forth, and the positivity rate, the rate of positive COVID-19 patients who test positive was below 5%, and it's just been a massive surge. I'm sure anyone in that position would feel a great deal of stress and responsibility. And at this stage, it appears that the pressure was too great. Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, so I mean, you've seen sort of instances of her, seeming to be like she got a lot of sort of credit for being very sort of candid and open, and a lot of what I heard was a lot of people pointing to sort of like an instance last week where she was discussing basically sort of like the backlog and testing, and she got kind of emotional about it. She was saying she was angry, she was tired, and that it shouldn't be this way in terms of the backlog, and just kind of in the context of discussing this new surge of cases. And she's been tweeting somewhat cryptically about kind of what forced her or made her decision. For her, on Wednesday, she retweeted this Washington Post story that was about how basically, and this is, a trend across the country, about how leaders of health departments across the United States have been stepping down. And, she was talking about, I'm going to say the exact quote: "Executive leaders are not the only people experiencing this external and internal pressure. It's wreaking havoc on staff throughout the entire system, regardless of pay grade." And she's kind of started, and she's been sort of sending out those kinds of messages over the past week or so. And over the weekend, she said, look, my resignation would not come as a shock to people who knew me, or people I worked closely with. And in her resignation letter, she mentions that this is, sort of like a tumultuous period right now for everybody. And then, she sort of pivots and says, look, I felt weird as a white woman coming in and taking over this position from another white woman. And I think the next MetroHealth director should be a person of color. So there's a lot she's kind of throwing out.
Yeah.
About sort of why she's leaving and, kind of what her thought process is. But, something that I'm hearing a lot is, exactly what Brian said, which is that, it just got to be so much.
Yeah. When I was,
go ahead.
I was going to say just say one thing. When I was interviewing her back in, I guess that was May, she said that she wasn't sleeping very much, that she, was only getting a few hours of sleep every night. And that's not really sustainable. I think that this was all signs are pointing to sort of a breakdown.
The thing is that she never really got a chance to be what a MetroHealth director would ordinarily envision the job to be. I mean, she came in a crisis situation. She never really got to, get to know the community in the way that she wanted to, or to do the job under conditions that were not, crisis conditions. One of the things that struck me as interesting in a Twitter thread that she put out over the weekend, unless I misinterpreted it, it sounded like she was saying that she was going to stay in San Antonio. She talked about wanting to get to know people in the community better and work with people in the community. Is that your sense about what she's planning to do? Because my assumption was, when she had made this announcement last week that she was stepping down, I figured she was going to move somewhere else. But do we know if she's going to leave San Antonio?
She hasn't consented to any individual interviews since the news broke. So I wouldn't be able to say one way or the other what her plans are, or even what her motivation was for leaving.
Yeah. Now, Colleen Bridge, go ahead.
Yeah, but I think that's interesting. This thread of sort of the idea that she, in essence, didn't get the chance to become a MetroHealth director. Essentially, she starts here in like late January, and is sort of hitting the ground running on all of this. Doesn't really get a chance to get to know the community. And something that I thought was interesting. I spoke with Councilwoman Ana Sandoval, who is the chair of the council community health and equity committee. And she's saying, look, maybe we need to separate these two things, right? You've got one person who just needs to run Metro Health, just do all of the normal things that the Metro Health department does. And then you have basically a coronavirus czar that basically handles, who is still kind of like a health official, but like, handles the actual response efforts, because maybe it is too much for one person. And I wonder if that's a solution to like all of these these health officials resigning all over the country.
Yeah. City Manager Eric Welch, in response to Don Emmerich's resignation, talked about the amount of talent in the MetroHealth department that has really come to the fore during this crisis. And I guess what will be interesting to see is whether the city decides to hire from within going forward. But Colleen Bridger, who was Don Emmerich's predecessor and had been assistant city manager for a while, and planning to leave city government, is going to fill that position for a while, and I guess the question will be how long she decides to stick around during this really difficult time. Along those lines, last week we had an incident involving County Judge Nelson Wolff, and to put things in context, we've seen case numbers in San Antonio just go through the roof, and over the past couple of weeks, we've consistently had 500 new cases a day. We've seen hospitalizations go from 108 on June 10th to 802 by the end of this past weekend. And Nelson Wolff was pushing to get a mask mandate in San Antonio area. He was finally able to find a loophole in Governor Greg Abbott's state orders, which allowed for businesses to require masks. And last week he was at a Lowe's on the Northwest Side. He saw someone who was apparently getting into an argument with a cashier, because the customer was not wearing a mask. And Nelson Wolff stepped in, and there was an incident that happened. Greg, if you could talk a little bit about it and what your reaction was when you saw the video, because this is an unusual thing.
Oh yeah, it's unusual, but so you see, Nelson Wolff kind of walk up to the cash register aisle, and he's completely, he's got that huge bandana. I mean, it's very distinctive. It's obviously Nelson Wolff,
right?
And you see in the foreground this large man who appears to be arguing with the cashier. He's not wearing a mask. There's no audio, so you can't hear it. And you see Nelson Wolff take notice. He kind of turns to the guy, reaches out to him, like he pulls out a business card, gets the guy's attention, and the guy slaps his hand. It's not, it's not a violent slap, and it appeared that that's all there was to it, but he still slapped his hand, knocked the card out of his hand. And, clearly, Wolff was intervening. I'm sure he, if he'd had a chance, I'm sure he would have introduced himself, explained, the why the guy should be wearing a mask, and the fact that it is, now actually, part of an order requiring him to wear one. Didn't get a chance. The guy left, and the sheriff's department got involved, of course, and big manhunt for the guy who slapped Nelson Wolff's hand. But I think he wound up, was it a misdemeanor? I can't remember.
Yeah, it started out as a felony, and I think it got downgraded to like something like disorderly conduct, misdemeanor.
That's right.
Yeah, I talked to Nelson Wolff the morning after the incident, and he seemed like he definitely didn't want to talk about it. I think he, maybe embarrassed isn't the word, but I think I got the distinct impression he thought it was kind of had been made into this tempest, but it really was this little thing in the teapot. And I think he ultimately asked for just kind of a slap on the wrist, pun intended, for the guy. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, it was kind of emblematic. I mean, we know that there are there's a portion of the San Antonio population that just refuses to wear masks and are militant about it. And he came face to face with that. And there's, in this case, like there was no talking reason to the guy.
I'll admit this, when the story started to break, when we heard, because he called the sheriff, and then, as you said, the sheriff's department got involved. When the first story started to break, before we saw the video, and it said Nelson Wolff assaulted at a store, I maybe expected something a little bit worse than it turned out to be. But I mean, it was, it's still a really weird thing to see. See somebody like slap a county judge, at a store.
I mean, it's, it's kind of, like I said, it's part of this incivility we see in our politics now.
Right.
And a lot of it's centering on, masks, it's the thing, that's the one reality we all share. And the question is, these days anyway, and the question is, do you wear a mask or do you not? I mean, most of us have chosen to wear masks. We see the value in it. But this guy did not. And, has anyone slap a guy's hand as a result.
Has anyone in the anti-mask contingent been able to articulate exactly why they're so opposed to this?
I would recommend the video and I can't remember what town in Florida it is, where there's like a group of people who went up in front of I think was the council or commissioner's court there, and there was one woman who said, I don't wear a mask for the same reason I don't wear underwear, because things got to breathe. And then there was one person who went up and basically said that this was like, that they were evil for mandating masks, and this was like they were doing the devil's work. And so I mean, ultimately it's a personal liberty issue for a lot of people on the right. But as many people have pointed out, if you substitute the word pants versus like masks, I mean, stores, we don't have any problem with the idea that stores mandate that you wear pants to, when you walk inside. But for some reason, requiring a mask during a pandemic is an infringement on personal liberty for some people, I guess.
Yeah. And I still think that maybe I'm wrong, but early in the pandemic, like think back to March and early April when, we had kind of this spate of stay-at-home orders, we had travel restrictions. Yeah. And, this was, it was a new experience for most of us. I mean, we've not lived through an outbreak like this. Right. And, a few months on, we get to May and the numbers start coming down. So we lower our guard, we start reopening businesses. And I just feel like it kind of infused everybody with this idea that it's okay. We can, masks really are voluntary. They're not, there's not a super critical need for them. And now the numbers are spiking again, but a lot of us are still in that kind of May mindset. It's hard to get the genie back in the bottle. Once you lift restrictions, how do you reimpose them, and how do you reintroduce that kind of sense of seriousness in public health policy?
I've been terrified this whole time. I don't know why everyone else is.
Yeah.
I've been cowering in fear for months. Like, why is?
Yeah, but I mean, you go out. I'm like, you go out over the weekend, go to any store you normally go to. My guess is it may not look like it. The crowds may not be what they had been in February, but they're definitely much larger than what you would have seen even in May. I mean, they just seem to be getting bigger.
And that's the larger question: is how do we get out of this situation right now in Texas without another lockdown?
Yeah,
I want to get to that.
I want to get to that and Greg Abbott and how he's handled this in just a second. But before we do, I just wanted to mention that Terry Toller, the person who allegedly slapped Nelson Wolff, he runs like an auto shop in town, and he is saying that Nelson Wolff was the aggressor in this case. And Mr. Toller's lawyer is former DA Nico LaHood, which is an interesting twist on this because people will remember when Nico LaHood was running for re-election. When he made his big announcement in 2017 that he was running for a second term, Nelson Wolff was by his side and endorsed his candidacy. And now they're on opposite sides of this case. Brian, you've written, I think, more about Nico LaHood than anyone. Did you have any thoughts when you found out that he was going to be representing the person who did this?
It wasn't surprising. Some people. I haven't interviewed Nico LaHood in over a year, or even spoken to him in over a year. But I mean, I can only make assumptions about why LaHood would have eagerly, represented this individual. But perhaps Mr. LaHood has similar anti-mask sentiments, or perhaps he relishes the limelight. I don't know. I mean, those are.
I was going to say, like, he strikes me as someone who, like, I wouldn't be surprised if he were an anti-masker, but he's also very good at insinuating himself in high-profile cases. I mean, he's a private sector lawyer now, and he probably recognized the opportunity right away of getting a lot of exposure, getting a lot of publicity.
That's right.
This.
That's right, and he does have a history as an anti-vaxxer, and he was a Democratic district attorney, but has made it pretty clear that he's shifted allegiances over the past couple of years. I wanted to talk a little bit about Greg Abbott because Greg Abbott, he probably got a lot of credit, certainly from President Trump for how things had gone in Texas, because we had been spared some of what many other states had gone through early on. And Greg Abbott, he kind of tried to walk this fine line where he tried to sound serious and responsible in dealing with the pandemic, but he was also very much in a hurry to reopen businesses again. He nullified the opportunity that local officials had to impose mask mandates and basically shut that down. He made an exception for churches, even when we did have a lockdown. And he took the side of Shelley Luther, a hair salon owner in Dallas, who defied his orders and reopened her shop. And basically, he condemned the judge who punished her for defying the governor's order. So he's I think taken a kind of a confusing series of steps on this, and last week, in the face of these numbers that we're seeing, he walked back the reopening of Texas, and he on Friday announced that he was going to shut down bars, which he had reopened about 5 weeks ago, and also is shutting down rafting and tubing, and reducing restaurant capacity from 75% to 50%. I'm curious to get all your thoughts on how he's handled this. Greg, if you want to start, I mean, what did you make of his reversal?
What was striking to me was, and this is, I think this says a lot about how the spike that in coronavirus cases that Texas is seeing, how dramatic it's been just over the last 2 weeks. I mean, he went from the week before kind of pussyfooting around with the mask order, basically leaving it to local officials, including Nelson Wolff, to figure out how to make masks mandatory. Right. Wolff figured out that you do it by requiring local businesses to require masks of their customers. And, so Abbott says, oh, okay, hey, you finally figured it out, like it was some kind of game, or he was some kind of sphinx, And you go from that to a week later, or a little more than a week later, and he is having to roll back part of his plan to reopen businesses in Texas. I mean, you reduced capacity of restaurants he rolled it back to 50%. Bars are closed, and tubing on the river is now banned. I mean, it was a pretty remarkable turnaround. He took a lot of heat for it over the weekend. You couldn't pick up, you couldn't look anywhere in the national press and not see something about Texas's big screw up in how Abbott handled the reopening. And at the same time, he's taking a lot of heat from his right wing, from groups like Empower Texans. Sure, they're giving him a lot of grief for going back on the reopening. So, I mean, he is in a tough situation. Part of it, though, part of the problem for Abbott is it was a self-inflicted wound. Yeah. And if you look at, I mean, kind of separately, I mean, we know that there are a lot more cases among younger adults, that it's now moving from the old folks to the younger folks. And the fact that, he banned tubing and, closed bars, I think that's pretty instructive. We don't know exactly where all of these new cases are coming from, what's originating, where the spike is originating from. But that's probably, those are probably two pretty good hints, and they both point to younger adults. Yeah.
Hey, Josh, what did you make of the governor's announcement last week?
Well, what was interesting to me, and this kind of got hidden later in the week. This was like Friday night, where, obviously, the mayor and county judge have both been frustrated by the idea that they no longer have any kind of sort of local control. Obviously, that's kind of been rolled back with to some extent with the mask restrictions. But at Friday's media briefing on the latest coronavirus numbers, Mayor Nirenberg was saying, "Hey, look, I hopped off the phone with Abbott, and he told me that he might be open to even greater sort of restrictions, allowing localities to basically take this power back." To one extent, he the governor is realizing the extent of the gravity of the situation, and perhaps the error of reopening too soon. But I mean, again, he doesn't want to take responsibility for it. Any other sort of restrictions once again. And something else that I noticed over the weekend was that there are a lot of conservative voices on Twitter saying Abbott's overreacting. Look at the hospitalization figures. Look at our ICU capacity. It's just fine. And that argument blatantly ignores the reality in many of our cities. Over the weekend, Texas Medical Center in Houston got so much flack for, the fact that they hit 100% of their base intensive care capacity and then just stopped reporting their numbers. And if you look in San Antonio, these numbers are pretty alarming. Like on June 1st, there were 93 people in the hospital. Today there are more than 800.
Right.
39 people were in the ICU in June 1st, and now there are 265. There were 20 people on ventilators on June 1st. Now there are 138. For most of May, the rate of people who were testing positive for the virus was hovering around 3.5%. Now, as testing has sort of ramped up in San Antonio, that rate has increased, which typically, if it was staying flat, would indicate that the disease was not spreading as much. But that's not the case. Yeah. So, I mean, you're seeing all of these pretty big and alarming jumps in these figures that he kind of couldn't ignore anymore.
Yeah, I think he's really worried about it. Brian, a couple of weeks ago, you pointed out when we were talking about him being unwilling to let local officials mandate masks. You said, "Well, this is going to be on him now," and I think that's true. I think everyone kind of sees it that way. I think that he has really become the focus of all the criticism, and probably rightly so. But
I mean, I think most people who were very closely following the news probably saw this coming. Yeah. I don't know why Abbott didn't see this coming, but what was it that he was saying? We're going to follow the doctors and the data or something. Yeah. He did not abide even by the Trump administration coronavirus task force's recommendations that you wait for 2 weeks of a decline in new cases. What strikes me is just a real sense of impatience. I mean, it's so impatient to reopen without acknowledging the realities of the virus and how it operates. I mean, it was not a science-based approach to reopening, even though Abbott kept reassuring Texans that that's exactly what he would be relying on. It just wasn't. And anyone who compared the timing of the reopening to the research and the recommendations from experts, it was painfully obvious in real time.
Mm-hmm. And, the thing is, if you look at where we're seeing the numbers spike, I mean, Florida, Texas, Arizona, these are states that had governors who were in a hurry to reopen, who had a lot of pressure from their political base to reopen. And this is what we're seeing there. Before we wrap things up, I want to just talk a little bit about the issue of police reform, which is continues to be a big one right now in this country. And Ron Nirenberg has talked a lot about how we have to change the way we approach the collective bargaining agreement with the police union. That there are terms that they've been getting that have made it too easy for officers who are guilty of misconduct to be able to stay on the force. And last week, the mayor introduced a resolution which got tabled, and my sense was that it sort of it didn't get a great response either from the council or even from activists who want to see police reform. And maybe I'm wrong about that. But Josh, what was your sense about how that whole thing went down?
So, for a couple of weeks, there had been sort of this talk that council, at the behest of Mayor Nirenberg, we're going to adopt this resolution that was basically going to outline the city's priorities for the upcoming round of negotiations with the police union over their contract with the city. Primarily focused on sort of the disciplinary issues that have gotten, SAPD, police officers, the police union, and the city all a bunch of bad press. Things like, the contract allows per se, the 180-day rule, which is basically that, if Chief McManus finds out about an alleged incident of misconduct, 181 days after the fact, he can't impose any sort of discipline for it.
Right.
The chief is also not allowed to use an officer's past behavioral issues when considering new disciplinary measures. And so there are a couple things like that. And on Thursday, the mayor put this before the council, basically saying, hey, look, like, we want this stuff out of the contract coming up. And, council basically, was of the opinion that, look, all of the stuff we're pretty much on board with, but, we got a copy of this 24 hours in advance.
Yeah.
And there doesn't appear to have been any community input on this, which is, he got that flack from both council members and from activists. And it's worth noting that, him not communicating with council members is a consistent theme of his administration.
Right.
And so basically this whole issue has been tabled until August when city council comes back. But, the mayor's thing was like, look, like, we need to show that we're acting quickly on this, and that we're saying, look, like, this is still at the forefront. We're on top of this. But, the council and activists apparently did not need that, is what that whole incident sort of struck me as.
Right. And the history is that in 2016, when the city and the police union came to a mediated settlement, it was after the fact, when you started to have objections raised, primarily from then Councilman Ray Saldana, that some of these terms were in the contract that were too beneficial to officers who had committed misconduct, and so. He raised objections, but by that point, most of the council was just ready to just put the whole collective bargaining issue behind them. So it looks like the mayor is determined to sort of plant his flag on this issue before the talks start up again, so that there will be no doubt that the council wants these terms to be changed.
Didn't then Mayor Ivy Taylor, wasn't she involved in some real kind of one-on-one negotiations with Mike Helly, and Mike refused to even entertain the notion of those reforms, and I think there was such an eagerness to actually get this through that the Taylor Act kind of folded on it.
Yeah, well, she had a re-election coming up in 2017, and this was going to be her second election where this contract was going to be looming over everything. And so she, I think then city manager Cheryl Scully was not really a big fan of the contract, probably more for fiscal reasons. But Ivy Taylor was really just, I think, determined, we want to get this thing behind us and kind of, clear the deck so that when she ran again in 2017, this wasn't going to be an issue.
And she got endorsed by the police union, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to wrap things up there. Thank you all for listening. Hope you all are staying safe, and we'll catch up with you next week. Take care.